Hi, everybody, and welcome to yet another Social Blueprint interview where we are always bringing interesting people to you. And today, I am thrilled to be joined by Charlotte Korchak from Stand With Us. And Charlotte is an absolute dynamo when it comes to advocacy, education, and a pro-Zionist slant, if you will. Charlotte, I must say before we get into it, I first found you on Instagram. I think it was the University of Georgia.
Yeah.
And it was a little spicy.
A lot of people found me that way.
Okay. Yeah. There was a video where I believe it was a Jewish pro-Palestinian student who wanted to say Kaddish for the Palestinians. And you were not only not having it, but I just thought I was blown away, honestly, Charlotte, by just your quick off the mark, coherent, but incredibly passionate speech to her. And I also want to say, not everybody agreed with you. Some of the kids did unfortunately walk out.
Only her and the other anti-Zionist Jew who was in the room. And also, I should stress, the only reason I didn't want her to say Kaddish was because she said she was going to say it for all of the people killed in Gaza, which included, at that point, 10,000 Hamas terrorists.
Right.
And more importantly, I also think, if you're conducting a talk, you don't let somebody hijack the space. This isn't a prayer space. This isn't a place where we're here to say prayers. If you want to organize a prayer service for the victims of this conflict, by all means, you can do that.
Right.
But I'm not going to let you hijack my event. And I think we need to take back decorum in this world because people, the younger generation just doesn't even know what that word means, let alone what it looks like. So I wasn't going to let her take control of the event that students had brought me out to conduct. So that was the main reason.
Yeah, well, speaking of that, about taking control, the first question I wanted to ask you about is having a conversation versus a knockdown debate, if you will.
Right.
And just discuss with us, please, just your approach.
Sure. So I always teach, first and foremost, it's not about debate. You can go to debate and you can learn how to debate, but really what you're learning when you learn how to debate is how to be right? At the end of a debate competition, one person wins and the other side loses, right? It's not about winning or losing. Really what we're trying to do is we're trying to not debate, but we're trying to create dialogue, right? Okay. We're trying to influence people and influence the way they think about Israel and about Gaza and the Palestinians. And really what it is just creating more nuance.
Right.
And you do that by approaching people in a different way. Now, if somebody is incredibly hostile towards you...
I'm sure you've seen it all at this point.
I have seen it all. And when somebody is incredibly hostile and they come not to listen, but to just yell...
Yes.
There's really nothing that you can do. It's not a matter of debate. It's a matter of just making your points and making sure that anyone else who's listening can hear your points and can understand where you're coming from. But the average person is not that person. They're not the person who's going to come and scream at you or demand an answer or come at you aggressively and say, you're committing this, that, and the other.
Right.
Oftentimes, it's somebody who says, hey, I think you've posted about Israel. Can you explain to me what's going on in Gaza? Because I'm hearing all this word, thing about it's genocide. And I'm just trying to understand. Right. And that's the average person out there. And I would actually say the average person is probably even afraid to ask that question at this point because the anti-Zionists have made them scared to ask it. Because if you don't take one side or the other, you are persona non grata for some of these people. So it's really finding that middle, those people in the center who you can really have a conversation with and create dialogue with, even if they might be so misinformed that they feel like they're leaning into the anti-Zionist camp.
Yes.
But if they're still willing to listen, they're not really in that camp.
Right. So it's really measuring, are they truly just incredibly hostile or are they just skeptical?
Yeah, I put it into three categories. I divide the audience up into three categories, what we call the 595. 5% of people who are Zionists, 5% of people who are anti-Zionists, and everybody else in the middle. Now, you have to define those terms. What's a Zionist? Zionism is the belief in a Jewish state in the land of Israel.
Right.
It doesn't have to be more complicated than that. It is, of course, more complicated than that.
Right.
But to the outside world, that's what it is. Believing in a Jewish state in the land of Israel. And if you believe in a Jewish state in the land of Israel, you're a Zionist. Now, what that state looks like, what the borders of that country are going to be, how it's going to govern, all of those things are up for debate within the Zionist camp.
But that's what you just said is what we really want to get from today is how to give a very short, as you said, a 3-second answer.
There it is. The belief in a Jewish state in the land of Israel, that's Zionism, right? And then you have the anti-Zionist. So if Zionism is the belief in a Jewish state in the land of Israel, then an anti-Zionist is somebody who's against the Jewish state in the land of Israel. Problem is that most people don't know what Zionism is, and so therefore they also use the term anti-Zionism wrong, right? They use it in a wrong way. They say, I'm an anti-Zionist, and when you ask them, well, what do you mean by that? They might say, well, I really disagree with the policies of the Israeli government. I really don't agree with this far right-wing government of Israel. Okay, well, that's not anti-Zionism.
No.
Right? Do you believe that Israel should exist? Yeah, of course. Of course I do. Okay, so you're not an anti-Zionist, right? An anti-Zionist is somebody who's going to say Israel should not exist. They will chant things like, from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. They won't recognize Israel on the map. They sometimes won't even use the term Israel.
Yes.
Right? They'll call it the Zionist entity sometimes, right? Things like that. So you have to still talk to somebody to know if they're in the anti-Zionist category. Even if they say, I'm an anti-Zionist, you still should have that conversation. What do you mean by that? Why do you feel that way? Because what we know is that then you have this middle, the 90% in the middle. And the 90% in the middle are oftentimes uninformed, apathetic. They just don't care. I think that's a lot of Australians.
Yes.
Definitely.
The average person.
The average person, they are just completely tuned out to any other conflict that's going on in the world. And then lastly, you have, I think, the largest audience of young people, which are misinformed.
Tell us more about that, because that is a crucial...
It's a crucial point, because when I say misinformed and don't put them in the category of anti-Zionist, that means that they're still influenceable. You can still influence the way that they're thinking by correcting the misinformation, right? So they might be misinformed to think, okay, there's a genocide going on in Gaza.
And that word, we hear that
often.
Yes.
And you just have to reframe it and say, well, hold on. Is it a genocide or is it just war?
Right.
And now you've given them another option, right? And we call that reframing.
Okay.
Right? And oftentimes, again, these claims that are made, they're exaggerations, right? So apartheid is a massive exaggeration. That's not what's going on in Israel. There's racism in Israel.
Yes.
It's not an apartheid country. So it's a reframing. You reframe from apartheid to democracy that has racism in it.
Yes.
Different. It's not genocide, but it's a war. And people are dying in this war. And innocent people are dying in this war. Let's understand why.
Right.
Right? And then what you could do is you could take that person who's misinformed, who thinks they know, and it's all about how you approach them. And you can really help them understand that there's more to the story that they don't know.
Right.
And that they have been misinformed. Correct the misinformation, add more information so that they can then better understand what's actually going on and have, like I said, a more nuanced understanding of the facts on the ground.
That's amazing, Charlotte. And I want to ask you, okay, staying cool under pressure.
Yeah.
Okay, now even, as I said, I alluded to it at University of Georgia, it was hot, but I must say, you never lost what I call your mind.
No.
Any tips for how to stay cool under pressure? Because as I was telling you beforehand when we were filming, I did become unhinged a little bit the other night.
First of all, I learned very quickly, you just can't. You cannot fully lose it.
Okay.
Because actually, once you do, like you just said, you stop thinking rationally.
Yeah,
absolutely. So really what happens actually neurologically is when you start to get angry, anger turns into rage, and you kind of, a different part of your brain starts to fire.
Okay.
As opposed to the rational side of your brain.
Yeah.
And that's why they always say, like, if you're ever in a fight with your spouse, like, take a walk around the block.
Definitely.
That's to prevent your brain from going into anger mode, where you lose rationale.
Yes.
And then you can't have a rational conversation.
No. And you may say something you regret.
100%. And so what you have to do is, I teach two things. One is, well, I'm going to say three things. One is just take a long, deep breath.
Okay.
And it really does, neurologically speaking, it actually helps prevent your brain from going to that place.
And has that happened to you, if you don't mind me, sorry, but like where you've been in some hostile situations and...
It happened to me yesterday. I was at the University of Sydney.
Tell us.
We set up a stall on campus. And literally, as soon as I was done taping up the sign, within about 2 minutes, 3 anti-Israel students approached me. And they actually framed it. They said, hey, is it okay if we ask you some questions? We are here to understand your perspective, to have a civil conversation, just to understand your perspective.
Right.
I said, okay. But as time went on, and there was a denial of things like the targeting and killing of children, for example, on October 7th, the inability of them to condemn it once I told stories that I was standing in the home of a family who lost 2 of their children because they had to jump out of their bomb shelter because it was filling with smoke, right? Basically, it turned into a gas chamber, and they had to jump out the window, and there was 2 parents, 4 kids, and they had nowhere to hide. And so what they did is they just put youngest child, and then the next, and then the next, and they piled on top of each other with the 2 parents trying to cover their bodies, cover the bodies of their children with their bodies. And Hamas terrorists came over to them and shot all of them. And the luck As actually what they probably had in mind was the 2 youngest kids survived. They managed to lie there underneath the bodies of their 4 family members until they crawled out and made it to their neighbor's house. And I stood in that home.
Right.
I stood in the spot where they were found. And when I said that, he said, well, that's awful, and nobody should be targeting children. I said, so will you condemn Hamas for doing that? No.
Right.
And as it kept going, I felt myself getting more and more heated.
Right.
And at one point I said, I even said this out loud. I said, you know what? I'm sorry. I'm getting a little heated. Let me take a second. And I recomposed myself. Yeah. And I said that out loud in front of these people. Also because there were a lot of people around us listening to this conversation.
Right.
Which I'll get back to in a second.
Okay.
Let's make sure we get back to it.
Okay.
So one is take a long deep breath and notice when also you're kind of getting that way. You gotta have that self
emotional intelligence
and that gauge, right? Yeah. And then the second thing that I try to always do is remind myself that in these conversations, I'm not just representing myself. I'm not just Charlotte on campus.
Right.
When people see you, they see you as Israel. You're representing Israel. And so if you get unhinged, if you get aggressive, then Israel's aggressive.
Yeah.
And so I try to remind myself it's bigger than me. It's more important than me.
Yeah.
And something that I also noticed in that exchange yesterday is I always teach my students that oftentimes what'll happen is they will slowly start to take steps towards you.
Yeah.
And sometimes it might be unconscious, but sometimes it really is intimidation tactics.
Okay.
And the thing is for men, they always want to hold their ground. And
yes.
so you won't move. And so then they get closer and it looks like there's then this
standoff.
Exactly. And so I am very conscious, and I always say, just take a step back. When they take a step towards you, just keep going backwards. And I realized, if we had started here, right, in front of the table, by the time we were halfway through the conversation, we were here. Wow. Because he had just kept encroaching. And so you also have to remember, this isn't war. I don't have to hold my ground, right? I can, and what ends up happening is they look like the aggressive one.
Right.
Rather than you giving off aggression, you look like the one trying to de-escalate while they're trying to escalate.
Is that also one of your, I don't know if you call it tricks, but one of the things is to try to seem like the rational one?
100%. It's not seem like. Be the rational one. Be the person who's there to give facts, to give information, and back it up.
Yeah.
Back it up with information. And that's really what I try to teach students more than anything else is know your facts and not just sound bites. Because I could say, I'll give you an example.
Yeah.
One of the accusations we hear all the time is ethnic cleansing, right?
Definitely.
And usually referred to the War of Independence and what the Jews did during the War of Independence, the Jews / Israelis. And I always use the right terminology because, of course, prior to May 15th, it was Jews, the Jewish militias, and then after it was the Israelis. But we always get this accusation.
Yes.
And it was hurled at me yet again yesterday. And I said, well, wait a second. It was the Palestinian Arabs, the Arabs of Palestine, those militias who started the war.
Right.
In November of 1947. Not the Arab countries who then joined in on May 15th. And they were kind of dumbfounded. What do you mean? Right. Now, if you just throw out that statement, people listening could be like, how do I know that's true?
Right.
Right?
I was going to ask that.
Well, then give details. And so I said, what happened was November 29, 1947, the UN passed the partition plan. It wasn't law, it was just a recommendation, but the Jews celebrated it. Right. in that land, in the British Mandate of Palestine. And so a bunch of Jews were out in Netanya, they were celebrating, and they boarded buses to go back to Jerusalem. And on the road back to Jerusalem in the early hours of November 30th, these 2 buses were ambushed on the road by Palestinian Arab militias. And that's how the War of Independence actually begins. And once you give that kind of detail,
right,
it's like people are on the side Googling it, and Google will verify it. And it's also really hard to deny that.
Right.
And usually you don't lie about details. Lies are big.
That's a good point.
Because the more details you give, the harder it is to keep track of them.
Yes, absolutely.
So lies are big. You get caught in your own story. And that's why police interrogators, they tell you to repeat the story over and over and over again. Because they want to show if there's any discrepancies. And the more you lie, the more discrepancies there's going to be as they keep telling you to repeat it. And so once you know the facts, and they're verifiable, then what you're really doing is you're giving somebody the opportunity to just, let me Google it. Right. And let me see.
And you said that, people around will Google it, and it brings back to your point where you mentioned that other people around talked about it.
I get asked this question all the time. Should I engage with the anti-Zionist?
I was literally going to ask you that.
Yeah. It makes sense. It's a very valid question. And my answer is always perhaps, which is always my answer, by the way, to a lot of things, because it's usually perhaps. It depends. It's contextual. It really depends on the context. And so in the case of they approach me, right? I'm at a table that says, ask me anything about Israel. They approach me and they start asking me questions. Yeah, I'll engage, knowing that probably these people are not coming up to be influenced. They're coming up to try to school me.
Right, exactly.
And I know that that's not going to work. But I also know that if I engage in this conversation, most likely people are going to start to gather around and listen to it. And what I realize is they're no longer my audience. My audience is really all the other people around me who are, I'm going to put in my head, the 90%ers. The people who don't know, are misinformed, and they're the ones who are listening. And so those are the ones that I can influence. And I just kind of use these anti-Zionists as, I hate to say it, but as pawns, right? As props in my attempt to educate other people. And you also can think about this online, right? Online, last week we were on our way, we were driving back from somewhere and I'm responding to a comment on one of my Instagram posts. And the guy in the back of the car goes, why are you bothering? And I said, it's not for them. It's for all of my followers who are reading these comments and my students who can take my response, which is full of facts, and replicate it when they're responding to people. Yeah. So I'm not responding for that person who, it might say at, this individual.
Right, it's a fake account and he or she's uninfluential anyway.
100%. But I'm putting it there so everybody else can read it and say, oh, okay, that's how you respond to that claim.
Yeah.
Right? And they have the information. They can screenshot it. They can use it in the future. So I always think when you engage with those people, it's not for them. Once you've decided they can't be influenced, don't bother. If it's a one-on-one conversation, that is a waste of your time. But if other people are watching, it's worth it. And the other thing that I would say is after, those three had approached me at the end, one of the USID kids came up to me and about 100 meters down, the anti-Zionists were protesting. Protesting. They had a table and they had a flag that they were waving. And he said, why don't we go over to them? And I said, that's not.
There's no point.
There's no reason to do it. Okay. It's just because if we go, who are going to be the people around? The anti-Zionists. Yes. You're going to engage with anti-Zionists surrounded by other anti-Zionists.
Right.
Worthless.
Yeah.
There's no reason to do that. And so you stand in your own space. If they want to come to you, the conversation is on your turf, on your terms, right? And so that would be the time to engage when other people are watching, right? Yeah. The only other reason that I would do it is because I just need to know what arguments they're making.
Yeah.
Like, and every day there's a new argument. So I have to know the arguments so that then I can teach all of my students how to counter those arguments. Right. So I'm a glutton for punishment, one might say, but I guess you can call it research.
Okay.
Yeah.
But speaking of glutton for punishment, but one thing I'm curious about, like physical issues, because here the protest, they do get, inevitably somebody gets arrested. Any thoughts about it? I think that the times where people are actually physically assaulted are incredibly rare. And it's usually, again, when Zionists approach their anti-Zionist rally, protest, fill in the blank. Okay. Right? Look, I'm from Los Angeles. Right.
Probably one of the most infamous cases of, a riot or a protest turned into a riot happened literally 2 doors down from my synagogue in Jerusalem. In LA.
Oh, okay.
Sorry. And it was in front of a synagogue. And here's what I know, though. I know the LA Jewish community. Right. I know some of those people. Yeah. And I know that we approached them. Right. And I know that we instigated some of those violent exchanges. Yeah. And so it's you got to know when to just not. But some Jews are fed up. Right. And so, yes, there can be a fear of being assaulted, but honestly, given my experience, especially on university campuses, you don't see it a lot. You just don't. It's so rare that it happens. And again, it's in those very heated circumstances. But I don't think I've maybe one time in my life that I remember a student just had set up a stall on campus and was with an Israeli flag. And I think I can, again, remember one incident. I believe it was in Pennsylvania where a kid got punched in the face. Right. But other than that, like, you don't hear about assaults happening against Jews. And I actually, the one thing we can't be is we can't be afraid. Yeah. Absolutely. You just can't. And I have this tendency to say, look, if I have to get punched in the face for being a Jew, okay. Right. It is what it is. I would so much rather that happen than me hide all the time that I'm a Jew to prevent the rare chance that that might happen.
Yeah, and as we've learned, that is not a strategy.
No, cowering doesn't work. Putting your head down doesn't work. Eventually, they are going to sniff you out. They are going to find you and do what they want with you. So better to just walk tall and proud as a Jew and be smart about it. Don't walk into a Palestinian, protest or riot.
Don't walk,
especially by yourself. And yesterday, what I really thought more than anything at this stall was it's all about power and numbers. One of the reasons that they also didn't come over and go is because it wasn't just me standing at the table.
Yeah.
It was me and a whole bunch of students, and more Jewish students flocked to this table throughout the few hours that we were there. Because first of all, they were so proud that there was finally something on campus representing them and telling their story. And so the more that we were there, the less likely they're going to come over to you and start something.
Yeah. Because
so power in numbers.
Absolutely. So I want to ask you about some common questions I'm sure you get, just really, I guess pure answers to, like, one of them that I personally get a lot is that whether it's the U.S. or Australia today, I believe that there are a lot of protests going on. Why are we funding Israel? And when they're committing genocide, and that the typical argument will go something of that, like, well, I'll respond back. What about in Nigeria? What about other confrontations? And they're like,
not the best response.
What?
Not the best response.
Right.
Because it's more of a whataboutism than it actually is addressing the issue itself.
Yeah, that's right. And their typical response would be something like, "But we're not sending them weapons."
Weapons.
Right. And I'm just curious about any tactical responses.
I mean, I would break it down relatively simply. I would look at somebody and say, well, if Israel was committing a genocide, the U.S. and Australia wouldn't be allowed to fund them. It's illegal, according to both of our laws. The American legal system and the Australian legal system says that you can't have those kind of relations. You would have to immediately cut ties with that country. And the simple fact that legal mechanism hasn't kicked in says that there is not a genocide going on right now. No international body in this world has declared officially what's happening in Gaza a genocide, because it's not one.
Yes.
It's not. It's a war.
Right.
It's a war against a diabolical terrorist organization that is actively using their civilians as shields.
I know.
They've dug tunnels.
Yeah.
I always say to somebody who tries to make this argument, I say, where's the battlefield in Gaza?
Right.
If Hamas is fighting just against Israel, right? Where's the battlefield? Where are their uniforms?
Yeah.
You don't see that because they fight within cities. And that's what's putting people in harm's way. And even with those difficult circumstances that Israel is fighting in, some of the most challenging, if not the most challenging circumstances to fight in modern day urban warfare, even with that, Israel is still managing to keep the civilian casualty count incredibly low. And now somebody's going to call me crazy. What do you mean it's low? 40,000, right? But hold on. 40,000 is the total number, right? So you got to look at somebody and say, but if it's 40,000, then how many terrorists have we killed? How can they all be innocent civilians? It doesn't make sense. And even Hamas has acknowledged that around 10,000 of those people were their own fighters, were their own terrorists. Israel estimates that we've killed about 15,000 terrorists. And once you understand that number, then the other number all of a sudden contextually changes. Because one, that means that there's 15,000 terrorists and 25,000 non-combatants.
Yes.
Right? That's a different number. And then when you actually look at the ratio, which people get very uncomfortable with this. Oh, how dare you break down human beings to ratios? And I look at them and I say, with all due respect, you're the one who weaponized the number against me. I didn't bring up the 40. You weaponized it against me, trying to use 40,000 against me. And so now what you're forcing me to do is contextualize and explain that number. So I'm not trying to break down these people into just a number. You did that.
Right.
And now I'm trying to explain that number to you.
Yeah.
15,000 to 25,000. That means that the ratio in this war for combatant to non-combatant is for every one combatant, we've killed 1.75 non-combatants.
Which is very low by historical standards.
The accepted standard in international law was 1 to 9.
Yeah.
Which is insane. A number that Israel would never be okay with.
Right.
Israel historically in our wars against our operations against Hamas in Gaza, it's been 1 to 1, the lowest in the history of this type of warfare.
Yeah.
The Americans, when they went into Raqqa and Mosul to wipe out ISIS, they killed 4,000 ISIS terrorists. They killed 10,000 non-combatants in the process.
2.5.
That is, 1 to 2.5 was their ratio, and nobody was screaming genocide.
No.
Why? because everyone understood the intent. The intent was to wipe out ISIS.
Right.
And tragically, innocent civilians were caught in the crossfire. And that is what's happening here. And the simple fact that we've managed to keep it below 1 to 2 says everything about how we're not targeting innocent civilians.
Yeah.
Considering that over 50% of the population in Gaza are women and children. So given that number, you would expect that the number would be significantly higher of women and children if we were indiscriminately firing in Gaza.
Yeah.
And even the UN a few months ago revised their numbers. They didn't change the total number of casualties. But what they did is they said the percentage that we had for women and children is actually much lower.
Yeah.
So it's you just got to know those numbers and be able to say to somebody, there's no genocide here. Now, hold on. Your question was about funding. But again, you got to establish it's not a genocide to then say, why we fund Israel? Because they're a democracy.
Exactly.
We have shared values with Israel.
Right.
They have freedom of speech for their people, and all of their people can vote, and and all of their people can run for office, and they have the freedom of press, and they have the freedom to protest if they're not happy with something going on, and they don't have to fear being shot in the street by their government. All you have to do is look at Tel Aviv every Saturday night for the last 2 years, pretty much, and it's there. And so that's why we support Israel, because Israel is fighting against people who are calling for its obliteration.
Yeah.
That's Hamas's charter. And because our governments, both the American and the Australian, are well aware of the threat of Iran and understand that this isn't just a fight against Hamas.
No,
it's a fight against Iran, who is not just funding Hamas, but is also funding Hezbollah and the Houthis in Yemen. Right. And this is a multi-front war that's being led by Iran. So you have to look at somebody and say, are you on the side of Iran? Or are you on the side of Israel? Are you on the side of the democratic country that is Israel that has shared values to our country?
Yeah.
Or are you on the side of a regime that literally beats women in the streets when they don't cover their hair properly?
Yeah.
That is fundamentally what we have to break it down to. And then look, and you say, look, that doesn't mean that I agree with every single policy of Israel or every single action taken by Israel. But we have to be able to distinguish between who is a friend and who is a foe. And between these two parties, Israel or Hamas or Israel or Iran, I think it needs to be very clear which one we should be supporting.
Yeah.
More than anything.
Not a question about it. Just turning a little bit back towards the Jewish religion itself.
Yeah.
I just took, by the way, your 5-part class. It was unbelievable. Fantastic. You. Everybody will put a link into it as well. Understanding where we came from, why is it so important today?
I mean, let's put aside the claim out there that we're colonizers for a second.
Yes.
Okay? Because it's so reactive, and I want to just I think it's been reactive up until now. I want to take a second to be a little bit more proactive about how we have this conversation. First of all, for the sake of our children, for the sake of the next generation, if you live in a place like Australia, you are a world apart from Israel, what it comes down to. Yeah. And what we have to remind our kids, our Jewish kids, is that they're part of a long chain, right? And they're a link in that chain. And for every Jew in the world, that chain links back to one place. And that's the land of Israel. Right? And so for us, it's about roots. Yeah. It's about heritage. It's about knowing where we came from. It's about the tradition that we come from. And understanding that no matter where we end up in the world, we always know that we have another home. Yeah. And when you do that, all of a sudden, Zionism becomes much more clear to a young person. Yeah. And I'm not a Zionist because of anti-Semitism. I'm not a Zionist because I need a safe haven. I mean, that's a reason that, of course, one of the many reasons I support Israel and believe in Israel, but that's not where my Zionism should come from. That's so reactionary. My Zionism comes from, again, that is our home. Right. And to help, it's the fabric of who we are. It's intrinsic in our identity. It's built into every one of our traditions, right? In daily traditions, weekly traditions, yearly traditions, and even every time somebody gets married in the Jewish tradition, right? Yeah. The last thing that we do before we scream Mazel Tov and everyone's allowed to go and dance and sing is we break a glass and we say the psalm that says, if I forget Jerusalem, it's as if I've forgotten my right hand. And we remember our connection to our land and know that we're not whole without our home. Yes. So that's for the Jews. Yes. Right? For us to understand our heritage and that link and that chain that we're all a part of. Now, for the outsider, it's more important now than ever because people are literally trying to cut us off from our land. They're trying to disconnect us from it. Yes, and so forth. Yes, and the anti-Zionist movement, they're trying to say, no, you're colonizers. You come from somewhere else. You're foreign to this land. How dare you?
Yeah.
I am the opposite of foreign to this land. I come from this land. I've been practicing traditions in one language for 3,000 years, and that language is Hebrew. That did not come from Europe.
Right.
It did not come from another place. It came from the land of Israel.
Right.
And most of the traditions that we do, again, are about the land in some way or another. It was about the temple service that we did in that land. It was about us going from slavery and wandering the desert until we got back to that land,
Absolutely.
right? It was about us finding oil so that we can light the menorah in our temple, right? In that land.
Yes.
Nes gadol haya sham.
Right.
A big miracle happened there, or in Israel we say, pa.
Right.
Here is where it happened. But they try to disconnect us from it. So it's more important than ever that everything I just said to you,
Yes.
that a young person can explain to somebody else, to say, you know, if you tell me that Israel is not my home, I don't really have another home. And they might say, what about Australia?
Right.
I could say, you know, most Jews arrived here in the last 100 years. Not Melbourne, I know. We came over with the penal colony.
Yeah.
We were part of that first penal colony, but most are recent immigrants.
Definitely.
And they're recent immigrants because usually they were fleeing somewhere else. They're Holocaust survivors, right? And so to say, well, you're just Australian, well, yeah, I might be, but my tradition is not Australian. The fact that I'm an Australian Jew means that that Jewish part links me back to one home.
Yeah.
And no matter where a Jew is in the world, that is their home. And it is fundamental for anybody who's not Jewish. It is fundamental to understanding who we are, to understand that we are a nation. We are not a religion. And a nation has a religion. Our religion is Judaism.
Right.
But the nation part also links us back to a specific land.
Right. And that's why you can't take the land and put it somewhere else.
No. And you can't remove it from the Jewish tradition. It's like my mentor Gil Troy says. He says, Jews are like the Oreo cookie, right? What makes up an Oreo cookie? You gotta have the cookie, you gotta have the cream. Can't have the cookie, can't have not the cream. You gotta have both to make it an Oreo cookie, right? The Jews are like an Oreo cookie, right? One side is the land, the other side is the religion, the tradition. You put it together and that makes the Jewish people. And you can't take one away. Otherwise, it's not an Oreo cookie. If you take one away, it's not the Jewish people.
Absolutely. Charlotte, you're incredibly passionate, but especially with young people. And I have a young guest right now that does want to ask you a couple of questions. If that's
Great.
okay.
Yeah, I'd love it. Hello. Now I should welcome you. Yeah.
Hi, Charlotte.
Hi.
In the past, we have faced anti-Semitism at inter-school sport. And how would you recommend we react in these instances?
So first of all, I'm going to, again, change that word, right? The react word. We need to be proudly Jewish, right? So yeah, if in the moment you experience anti-Semitism, how should you react? It depends on the type of anti-Semitism, right? So give me an example.
Saying like, you're a Jew, we hate you.
I would say, you know what? I am a proud Jew. And if you choose to hate me, that's your choice. But that's really unfortunate. Because I'm not going to judge you based on one characteristic of yours. Why would you judge me based on one characteristic of mine? And if they say something like, well, Jews are bad. I would say, all Jews? Is that what we do with any other group in this world? Right? Well, some Jews. And I say, yeah. How about this? I'm not going to judge you by the worst of your kind. How about you don't judge me by the worst of my kind? And how about instead we actually have a conversation and get to know each other instead of hating each other because of an immutable characteristic that we don't really have much control over.
Yeah.
Right? And that's like an approach where you're actually trying to maybe bring about the conversation. But again, it's wearing your Judaism with like a badge of pride. If somebody says, oh, you're a Jew, I would say, yeah, I'm proud of it. Is there a reason that I shouldn't be?
Yeah. And following on to that, what are 3 facts that all of us teenagers should know as a strong argument to defend ourselves?
First of all, again, when it comes to Jews, there's nothing to be ashamed of. This is a people that you should be incredibly proud to be a part of. We are a people who have been endlessly persecuted, and yet we've never embraced victimhood. We've never asked for the pity of the world. We just keep going, and we are survivors. And that is an incredible tradition to be a part of. It teaches you to be successful. It teaches you to move forward. It teaches you how to get over things faster. And that's why Jews have a tendency to be very successful in this world. So just know the legacy that you're a part of. Be proud that you come from a people who, in an era where there's literally like victimhood Olympics going on right now, and victimhood is a currency, that it's not a currency that we want to have, that we want to use, right? We're survivors. And more than that, we don't just survive, but we thrive as a people. And that should instill in you tremendous pride. Second of all, the country, Zionism, right? What is Zionism? The belief in a Jewish state in the land of Israel. Important word that you should always know how to define, because I think most Jewish students would describe themselves as Zionists, and oftentimes they might be attacked for that. And you should know how to quickly define that term, right? Zionism is the belief in a Jewish state in the land of Israel. Nothing to be ashamed of. And I mean, again, the main reason that we needed that country was because of how the world treated us, not because we were demanding it just because, right? I think, and then understanding that the manifestation of Zionism came in the form of a democratic Jewish state, right? A country that said, yes, this is going to be a home for the Jewish people, but if there is another people who live in this land, right? If you end up in our country and you become citizens of our country, you should be treated equally. And the law says so, right? Now, of course, we're not perfect. And I think that's something else that Jews have to understand, that sometimes we only highlight our flaws, right? But when we talk about our flaws, the purpose of it is to get better and to understand that the benefits of the Jewish people, the positives of the Jewish people far outweigh the negatives. And so, yeah, let's understand the flaws and let's understand how we can correct those things. So Israel is not a perfect country. The Jewish people are not a perfect people, but we have a solid foundation of values to work off of. So Israel was founded as a democracy. It's an important thing to understand what that means and what values that upholds, and be proud that your country upholds those values and strives to continue to really to reach those values every day, even though we're not always successful. So I know that was a little bit of a long-winded answer, but again, it's pride in who we are as a people and the legacy that we come from. It's understanding what Zionism really means and what it means to each one of us and why it came about, and then how it manifested, which is as a democratic Jewish state where Jews can thrive in this world and be safe in this world, but also treat the other amongst us, right? The non-Jew amongst us equally and fairly within that state of ours. Something that we as Jews throughout history never really were afforded.
Yeah.
And if we were, it was always for a temporary period.
Yeah.
But we started our country saying, no, everyone in this country is going to be equal. Instead of kind of taking what happened to us and then being spiteful towards others, we did the opposite. We took what happened to us and we said, we're not going to do this to others.
Yeah.
Something to be proud of as well.
And following back onto one of Greg's questions, what would a general response be for you with an anti-Semitic comment online?
So it depends on the comment, right? If it's an anti-Semitic comment that's dressed up as anti-Zionism, it's a little bit different, right? Then it would be an attack against Israel, and then it would really just be tackling that. If it's just raw anti-Semitism, I don't know if it so much deserves a response other than pointing out why it's anti-Semitic. And that's not for the person who posted it, right? If the person who posted it is anti-Semitic. But also, I would stress giving that person the benefit of the doubt. A lot of times people say things that are anti-Semitic and they have no idea that what they're saying is anti-Semitic. And so for me, if my friend, let's say, let's take a real scenario that probably has happened to you and to many, many Jewish students over the last 11 months. One of your friends posts something on their story, on their Instagram story, that you feel is anti-Semitic, right? The way that I would address that is I would send them a private message and I would say this: hey, I'm sure you didn't mean anything malicious by what you posted, by this post, but it's pretty offensive to me. And again, I'm sure you didn't mean anything by it, but would you mind talking to me about it? And again, you approach them with grace, with the benefit of the doubt, give them a space to say, oh my God, I had no idea. Can you explain to me why? And they might not take that opportunity. They might say, no, you're wrong. It's not, I don't care. And then you know who your real friends are, right? But with the person who's really a friend, if you approach them again with grace and kindness, as opposed to, that's so anti-Semitic, how can you post something like that? How would anyone respond to that? Not well. Yeah. They're going to be put on the defensive right away. And so instead of putting them on defensive, give them a way out to say, whoa, I had no idea. This is the last thing that I want to say on the anti-Semitism thing is, most people who express something anti-Semitic, it's not coming from a place of malice. It's coming from a place of ignorance. And that gives me great comfort because that means that I can help stop that through education.
Yeah.
It is much harder to deprogram malicious anti-Semitism out of somebody. That's a whole another ballgame. But to take a young person and to point out why something is problematic for them and help educate them to understand why they shouldn't do it again. The difference between criticizing the Israeli government or Israeli policies versus criticizing the entire existence of the state of Israel, right? And pointing out those differences. Or just the simple anti-Semitic tropes that we hear. Things like, well, Jews have too much power. What's too much power? Where do the Jews have too much power? Are the Jews using their power for evil? Like, what are we talking about, right? And you have that conversation. Casual anti-Semitism that's not malicious, that can be addressed. And the reason that they're probably saying it is because they probably just heard it from somebody else. And once you approach them that way, you can nip it in the bud.
Yeah.
And all of a sudden educate them to then educate others. And then we stop the spread of anti-Semitism.
Yeah. We just wanted to say thank you, and we really appreciate you coming and chatting to us today and educating us all.
Of course. Thank you guys so much for doing this. It's really an amazing project. So thanks for having me on. And thanks for taking my crash course. I highly recommend it the next time that I do it, if anyone wants to join in the fun of learning a lot about Israel and going way more into depth. So thank you all so much. Really appreciate it.